What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be about Manchester City versus Chelsea in the Champions League final, where Chelsea won 1-0 against Manchester City. Tuchel beat Pep for the third time in a row this season in the last game in the Champions League in the final. So now before we start, check out my book. It's on Amazon. There's a link in the description below, so be sure to check that out. And then also, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. And let's get right into it. So Chelsea built from the back as they did under Tuchel for ever since he took over. This consisted of asymmetry with Azpilicueta, Thiago Silva to the right of Mendy, and Rudiger on his own on the left-hand side. So the three central defenders were split by Mendy, with two central defenders to his right and one to his left. Now Manchester City looked to counter this by pressing in a 4-1-4-1 or a 4-3-3, depending on how you want to look at it. The front three with Sterling on the left, they looked to match up and split the field in half and press Chelsea into the wide area, into this corner of the field, and force them to give up possession. And they were covered by Kevin De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva as the two attacking midfielders, who were both in front of Ilkay Gundogan. This allowed Manchester City to play more man-oriented and have more horizontal lines of pressure in their high block, as well as still creating access to the wide areas via their wingers, who had the dual roles of using their cover shadow as well as jumping to the wide central defenders, but trying to block access to the wide areas. Now they defended with numerical equality, and what this means is when the ball would be played to one side and possession was established on which side of the field it would go, the strong-sided fullback of Manchester City would jump, and the other three would shift over and match up against Chelsea's front three, leaving the free man on the weak side via the wing back. And here we are again. We can see clearly each team's shape when Chelsea are in possession of the ball with the 4-3-3 of Manchester City, and we also even start to see the jumping of the fullbacks via Kyle Walker taking care of the wingbacks, and Zinchenko is just off our screen here to the left-hand side. And now we see the initial build-up shape from Chelsea with the three central defenders collecting the ball from Mendy in goal. We have our double pivot, and then our wingbacks holding our width, and the front three starting very high to try and stretch the Manchester City defensive lines when Manchester City do play in their high block. And one thing to note that we didn't note in the previous picture is the positioning of the double pivot of Chelsea, with Jorginho playing more centrally and Conte playing more oriented towards the half space to give him a little bit easier decision-making process with his more positive field of view in the half space and giving him stronger connections into the wide areas. When the ball would be played out, Manchester City, we would see, would go and press man-to-man, becoming more man-oriented, especially when the press was established, as we see here, De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva jumping to the double pivot, and then Mahrez on the weak side maintaining his dual roles, not committing quite and conceding so much space, but splitting the difference. And now we see Zinchenko jumping to the wing back, so they have numerical equality on this strong side of pressing, and then protected by a 3v3 just behind them, with then Ilkay Gundogan, always the pivot just off our screen, fronting the back four, or the two central defenders of Manchester City, protecting against any longer passes that might be lower in height. And here is Gundogan just arriving at the bottom of our screen, again protecting the two central defenders and fronting the forward three of Chelsea, preventing from any direct passes that might be lower in height into a target player of the Chelsea front three. As Chelsea would move higher up the field, their back three would take a more symmetrical look, and when Thiago Silva got hurt, Christensen came in for him. Rudiger and Azpilicueta played through the half space, and then protected by Conte and Jorginho, who were the double pivot, who had a crucial role, and both played a little bit deeper than normal to protect against the Manchester City offensive transition when they would lose possession of the ball. The front three of Kai Havertz, Mason Mount, Timo Werner played between the lines. Timo Werner often playing higher up the field, threatening in behind trying to create space for Mason Mount and Kai Havertz between the lines, while width was being held by the wingbacks of Chelsea, Ben Chilwell and Reece James. For Manchester City, when Chelsea would have possession higher up the field, they would move more towards a 4-4-2 when they were recovering from being broken, and when they were on the front foot actively looking to win the ball back, they switched from a 4-4-2 to a 4-2-4. And Ilkay Gundogan, being the lone pivot in the high block, he played a little bit deeper role, still trying to create some defensive staggering, controlling the space in between the lines, trying to prevent Chelsea from progressing the ball. So here we are when Manchester City is looking to actively win the ball back and get out of their defensive low or mid blocks, and now they're being more proactive in their defensive movements. They shift to a 4-2-4 to try and go more man-oriented, with their wingers coming a bit narrow, looking to create access to the wide central defenders of Chelsea, as well as the two forwards, splitting their roles, one pressing the ball and the other using his cover shadow to block passes into the double pivot of Chelsea. Now for Manchester City in possession, they had a few variations they looked to play with. They did use Zinchenko's inverted fullback some of the time, but not as often as they have done this season, because they look to stretch Chelsea more horizontally to then create space centrally for these central players. They went with Gundogan as a holding midfielder, with always at least 3 players between the lines, and this shape here, their midfield shape in the central corridors, is what we'll look at and how they changed it to try and solve the problems of Chelsea's defense. In this picture, Manchester City went with 3 players between the lines, giving Chelsea a relatively easy chance to go more man-oriented of the central defenders, matching up 1v1 with protection from the double pivot in front of them, shielding and using their cover shadows from blocking certain passes between the lines. And now Chelsea defensively, they went with a 5-2-3 with their wingers more oriented towards the fullbacks, and this 5-2-3 made it very easy for them to shift into a 5-4-1 lower block when they needed to. So as we see here, another structural change from Manchester City when Zinchenko would come more narrow. This would then create a pinning situation in the half space, which we can see on both sides for a lot of instances in the game. We have an asymmetric back four, Zinchenko inverts, and what this inversion does is it creates space from the pinning higher player up the field, pinning the wide central defender of Chelsea. Zinchenko vacates the space into the wide area, which gives Sterling more space to isolate himself 1v1, but oftentimes this pass was over too large of a distance and was too volatile and could be picked off too easily, which is why they didn't invert Zinchenko very much. But when Zinchenko did invert, or they had 5 players in this central corridor in the midfield areas, they often used these players to pin the wide central defenders and create vertical relationships between these advanced midfielders, with Ilkay Gundogan as the single pivot looking to exploit this space. And here again, Manchester City in possession now, and we start to see a more typical shape from them with a 5-man midfield with a more pentagon-like structure with 2 players in the half spaces, a double pivot, and a number 10/number 9, depending on his height, looking to play between the lines. And this is countered by Chelsea's 5-4-1, which was very compact and had both elements of compactness as well as the freedom of wide central defenders to jump between the lines. So not only was the space controlled between the lines from vertical compactness and general spatial control elements like compactness, but also from movements of the wide central defenders to jump into these areas to then put pressure on Manchester City players between the lines, as we have highlighted with Rudiger here. So now looking at Manchester City's structure and how they tried to pin Chelsea's wide central defenders, we have our back four playing with a little bit more asymmetry with how Kyle Walker and Zinchenko position themselves, But also the big difference here was how the wide players would come inside here and overload the half spaces and then create two players in the advanced areas between the lines, both positioning themselves on the wide central defenders of Chelsea, trying to effectively pin them and then free up space for the offensive midfielders of Manchester City to then receive the ball and break lines going further forward. But this again was countered by Chelsea. Their double pivot was very effective because of the front three as well. These two systems work together very well to then block off space where the other couldn't. So where the cover shadows failed to block from the front three, the double pivot of Conte and Jorginho was there to cover up, which gave them a high level of spatial control and made this pinning from Manchester City relatively ineffective. Now the last shape for Manchester City that we have prepared is again with the traditional back four, but now we have a double pivot, looking to then create passing angles between Chelsea's front three. As we see here, we have press-resistant build-up structures with a double pivot trying to arrive between the Chelsea front three, and with the double pivot naturally positioning themselves between the Chelsea front three, we also have a more natural number 10 of Phil Foden dropping between the lines with narrow wingers now, creating a three-man forward system and trying to create Phil Foden as the free man between the lines. But as we see, the distance Phil Foden is from the build-up and the fullbacks is very large, so it would be very hard to generate superiority and form meaningful connections into these areas. But anyway, it was a huge game tactically for both teams. Chelsea just edged it 1-0 at the end of the day. And when Aguero came on, it would have been nice to see him get a goal and save Manchester City one last time. But it didn't work out that way. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.